In March 1998, a brutal crime in an Italian town shocked Italy and made national headlines. Nadia Roccia, an 18-year-old student from Castelluccio dei Sauri, was found dead in a garage under mysterious circumstances. What initially appeared to be self-inflicted quickly unraveled into something far more sinister. Nadia had actually been slain by her two best friends in a coldly premeditated plot. The case became notorious not only for the heartbreaking betrayal, but also for the strange hints of the occult that emerged during the investigation. Nadia Roccia was a bright, well-liked high school senior in her hometown of Castelluccio dei Sauri in southern Italy. She had been close friends with two classmates, Anna Maria Botticelli and Mariana Sica, since childhood. The trio often studied together and shared dreams of leaving their small town to start a new life in America after graduation. Nadia initially offered to help her friends achieve this goal, promising that her uncle in the States could assist them once they finished school. However, she later retracted that promise, realizing it wouldn't be possible since she made this promise without consulting her uncle and without knowing the immigration system. This reversal upset her two friends deeply, and feeling betrayed over their dashed American dream, Botticelli and Sica began to harbor resentment toward Nadia. According to one version of these tangled events, that broken trust from this seemingly small event turned to simmering jealousy and would soon turn deadly. Determined to make Nadia pay for what they saw as disloyalty, Botticelli and Sica spent months plotting to eliminate her. They even experimented with different methods. At one point, they tried to poison her by secretly spiking a drink with rat poison, but Nadia fortunately refused to drink it, sensing something was off. Personally, if I was Nadia, the rat poison cocktail may have been my cue to go to the cops. But hey, I'm not an Italian teenage girl circa the 1990s, at least last time I checked. After a number of buffoonish failed attempts that read something like the CIA trying to knock off Castro, the pair decided on a more direct approach. They also simultaneously prepared a cover story so they could get away with it. They tricked Nadia into signing a blank sheet of paper under some pretext, intending to use her real signature on a letter later. That letter would explain to investigators why she had chosen to do this to herself. Botticelli also sowed rumors that Nadia had a crush on her, a lie that would reinforce the narrative in the note. All these steps show the deliberate and cold-blooded planning behind their actions. On March 14, 1998, the two friends put their grim plan into action. Under the guise of an ordinary study meetup, they lured Nadia to the Botticelli family's garage that afternoon. Once Nadia was inside and off guard, they attacked. Mariana Sica crept behind Nadia and yanked a scarf tightly around her neck, while Anna Maria Botticelli held Nadia down. Nadia struggled, but together the two managed to strangle her to death. With Nadia's lifeless body on the ground, the two girls immediately set about staging the scene. Also, as a quick aside, I'm not sure how any of this was supposed to help these two idiots get to the States, but I digress. They tied a rope around Nadia's neck, though notably her body was found on the floor with no high ligature point, a detail that would later raise suspicions. Next, they placed a typewritten note nearby, which they had composed beforehand, and which was supposed to wrap everything up in a nice, neat little package. Using the sheet signed by Nadia, the note was crafted to sound as if Nadia wrote it herself. In it, she supposedly confessed to being a lesbian in love with Anna Maria Botticelli and claimed she couldn't go on living with this secret. Anna Maria Botticelli was supposedly just that alluring that life without her was just straight up pointless. Wow. Totally not suspicious at all. The letter even went so far as to include a makeshift will, where Nadia supposedly said that she wanted her two friends to have all her savings and possessions. In a final deranged twist, This was supposed to be so they could go on an all-expenses-paid trip to the United States. After arranging this scene to tell a false story, the two girls left the garage. To make their ruse convincing, Botticelli and Sika then ran to Nadia's mother in a panic, claiming Nadia had suddenly fallen ill and locked herself in the garage alone. They returned with Nadia's family and discovered the horrific scene they had staged: Nadia on the ground with a rope around her neck and the dramatic goodbye letter. The community was stunned and initially believed the story, but investigators at the scene noticed that certain clues didn't add up. From the outset, police found the staged scenario dubious. The tone and details of the typed note struck them as unnatural for a genuine goodbye note, and its instructions conveniently rewarded Nadia's friends. Physical evidence at the scene also contradicted a hanging, since the body was on the floor, and there was no viable way Nadia could have suspended herself. And it's not just that the two girls tried to put her up somewhere and underestimated how hard this would be to do, it's that it was an impossibility. These inconsistencies prompted a deeper investigation almost immediately, and an autopsy soon confirmed that Nadia's cause of death was strangulation. With signs pointing to something much darker, suspicion quickly fell on the last people to see her alive: her two supposed best friends. When questioned, the two girls stuck to their story and played dumb, but they agreed to let the cops look through their possessions to prove their innocence. But as investigators searched their belongings, they uncovered something startling. Both girls' bedrooms were overflowing with satanic and occult goods, and I'm not talking about some Magic the Gathering cards, a Labubu, or a copy of Final Fantasy III here. Though to be honest, if the cops stumbled across a Labubu find in '98, that would be highly disturbing indeed. Police found strange esoteric symbols and objects associated with Satanism and black magic. Coupled with the lack of an obvious conventional motive, these discoveries raised the possibility that Nadia's slaying had been part of a cult-like ritual. Hoping for more insight, detectives secretly bugged the suspects' conversations. The recordings made the case even more bizarre. Botticelli and Sika were overheard whispering eerie, cryptic phrases praising Lucifer and talking about the devil. These unsettling exchanges, combined with the occult items found, lent credibility to the theory that the girls might have eliminated their friend as part of an occult ritual. For a short time, the satanic ritual hypothesis was taken seriously. The media reported on the possibility of devil worship playing a role in the crime. However, investigators soon took the position that these occult clues were an elaborate smokescreen. They began to believe Botticelli and Sika had planted the Satanist materials and intentionally talked about Lucifer to mislead the police. In other words, under this theory, the teenagers tried to create a fake occult narrative to divert attention from their true motive or to create an insanity defense. Confronted with the autopsy results, the inconsistencies, and the intercepted conversation about the occult, the two girls sang like satanic canaries. They even agreed to reenact the crime at the garage, demonstrating to police how they strangled their friend. With the truth of their guilt established, attention turned to why Botticelli and Sika committed such an atrocious act. The occult angle was ultimately dismissed as fabricated by the investigators. Still, Botticelli attempted to offer a more fleshed-out supernatural explanation for their actions that went beyond simple run-of-the-mill devil worship. She told investigators that Mariana Sika's deceased father had appeared in her dream and instructed her to sacrifice Nadia. According to this bizarre claim, the deceased father claimed that a demon demanded Nadia's death as part of a pact, and these brides of Baphomet had no choice but to obey. Officials didn't find this story credible at all, because they believed the girls were under the impression if they were found insane, there wouldn't be any consequences. In essence, the authorities believed that the two girls thought that a finding of insanity means you get to go home and then hop on a plane to America. Psychological evaluations declared both girls perfectly sane and fully accountable for their deeds. That said, this doesn't disprove that they weren't motivated by a belief in Satan. It just means that they weren't suffering from psychosis at the time of the attack on Nadia. Whether the slaying of Nadia was actually occult motivated or not remains hotly debated. Given that virtually nothing about their motive or actions makes sense, and given that occult materials were found in their possession, I don't believe it can be ruled out. Another theory floated by a prosecutor was that the two girls were romantically involved with each other. If this was accurate, Nadia had become an obstacle or unwanted third wheel in their relationship. Under this idea, jealousy or fear of Nadia revealing their secret could have driven them to eliminate her. This motive remained speculative and was never proven in court, but it added another possible lurid dimension to the case. In the end, no definitive single motive was officially confirmed, and it literally may have been as simple as revenge for not getting help in going to America. In 1999, a court convicted both and initially sentenced them to life in prison. Their youth and the unusual circumstances of the case led to multiple appeals. In 2001, an appeals court reduced their sentences to 25 years each, but they continued to appeal. In 2003, this led to a plea bargain that set their sentences at 21 years, though neither of them would end up serving their full sentence. Around 15 years after the event, in 2013, Mariana Sica was released from prison on good behavior. Anna Maria Botticelli was released a few months later, though for her this was due to her ill health from multiple sclerosis. Upon release, the two were given new identities and reportedly settled in different regions of Italy to live in anonymity. Nothing is publicly known about their lives after prison, and if you're one of my viewers in Italy, well, one of them could be your neighbor, and you wouldn't even know it. Unless one of them writes a book, it seems unlikely that we'll ever know their true motivation for this horrible act against Nadia. Hey everyone, Jimmy reminding you to like and subscribe and to tap the notification bell. Also, once you're done with this video, check out my other channel, Lazy Chill True Crime, where I deal with solved cases. Imagine receiving your son's body back from an overseas holiday only to discover that a vital organ is missing. Bali is often thought of as a tropical paradise, a place of beaches, temples, and vibrant nightlife. But for the Haddo family, it became the setting of an unfathomable tragedy. Their 23-year-old son, Byron Haddo, died there under mysterious circumstances in 2025, and as if that weren't enough, his body was returned home without his heart. This shocking turn of events cast a grim spotlight on the case, raising urgent questions about what really happened to Byron and why his heart was left behind. Byron Haddo was a young mine worker from Queensland who traveled to Bali for a much-needed holiday in May 2025. He was staying with a friend at a private villa in Bali's Seminyak tourist area. On the morning of May 26, 2025, that getaway turned to tragedy. Byron was found unresponsive, face down in the villa's pool. Local authorities initially declared that he had drowned, and a death certificate was issued citing this as the cause. Notably, it remains unclear whether Byron was officially pronounced dead at the villa or at a hospital later, one of many details of this case that remain murky. Those with him even told Byron's family that no foul play was suspected, and that he had simply drowned in the pool by accident. However, details soon emerged that made his death anything but a straightforward accident. Although Byron's body was discovered on May 26th, the incident wasn't reported to police until 4 days later. By this time, the scene had likely been disturbed and critical evidence contaminated. This unexplained delay was a major red flag. It also emerged that 3 Australians, a friend of Byron's and 2 women, had been at the villa that night and left Bali soon after without ever being questioned by police. This fact angered the family, since these witnesses might hold vital information about Byron's final hours. Further red flags surfaced when Byron's body was examined. The towels used to wrap his body were reportedly bloody, and he had multiple cuts and bruises on him. An autopsy in Bali confirmed bruises on his forehead, on one of his eyelids, and a knee injury consistent with blunt force trauma, along with evidence of bleeding and head injury. These injuries are, of course, incredibly difficult to reconcile with a simple drowning. Because of these findings, Balinese police treated the death as suspicious, and the Haddo family insisted on an in-depth post-mortem. They even had a family friend arrange an autopsy at Bali's main hospital, so an independent examination could be done. Dr. Gunawan, a forensic specialist in the area, conducted the autopsy and found elevated alcohol levels and the presence of an antidepressant called duloxetine in Byron's system. She noted that this combination could have impaired his ability to pull himself out of the water, supporting a possible accidental drowning scenario. However, Dr. Gunawan couldn't conclusively determine the cause of death, and her report suggested drowning was likely, but not proven. She was especially concerned given the unexplained injuries that still raised numerous unanswered questions. Byron's body remained in Bali during these examinations and was finally flown home to Brisbane about 3.5 weeks later, on June 18, 2025. And that's when this disturbing and odd tragedy began to develop into a full-on international incident. During a second autopsy in Queensland in Australia, just 2 days before Byron's scheduled funeral, officials discovered that his heart was missing. No one had warned his parents that Bali doctors had removed and kept his heart after the initial autopsy, so the family was blindsided by this development. Byron's mother recalled that her own heart sank upon hearing the news, and it was an almost unthinkable blow after all they'd been through. To make matters worse, they were asked to pay $700 to have the organ shipped back. The family was outraged, calling it an inhumane and devastating shock. Even the Australian consulate in Bali was unaware of the heart's removal, according to Byron's parents, making the situation all the more alarming. This bizarre episode naturally fueled public speculation of sinister motives or a cover-up. However, Balinese authorities denied any foul play or organ theft regarding the missing heart. The hospital in Bali explained that retaining the heart was a standard procedure during a forensic autopsy, done at the police's request for further pathological analysis. Under Indonesian law, no family consent is required for such examinations, and they pointed out pathologists worldwide often temporarily remove organs for further testing. Notably, they don't appear to have commented on keeping the organs indefinitely, and if that's also industry standard worldwide. According to the hospital, Byron's heart was kept only until all testing was completed and was then returned through official channels for repatriation. In the view of Indonesian officials, nothing nefarious occurred, which doesn't surprise me since they were investigating themselves. But the lack of communication about this process caused tremendous distress for the family and cast a shadow of suspicion over the case. At this point, Byron's cause of death remains officially undetermined, and multiple theories have emerged. The initial toxicology results pointed toward an accident, and this is what the Indonesian authorities continue to maintain. Shortly after his death, his mother publicly questioned how her fit, healthy 23-year-old son could have wound up dead in the villa pool, with significant evidence of physical trauma. The family has retained a lawyer to advocate for justice for Byron. This attorney noted that Byron's bruises, bleeding, and head trauma are inconsistent with the notion that he simply slipped and drowned, reinforcing their suspicions of foul play. Instead, the family firmly suspects foul play was involved and believes he may have been dosed for the purposes of a robbery. As of this writing, active investigations are currently underway in both countries. In Queensland, the state coroner's inquiry is re-examining all the evidence, and no findings have been released yet from that inquiry. In Bali, police have reopened their probe and have requested help from the Australian Federal Police to locate and interview the 3 Australians who were with Byron. Indonesian investigators say they need the witnesses' testimony to fill in the timeline, but as of yet, those key accounts remain missing. Interestingly, of course, they didn't need this testimony to draw a conclusion before the family hired a lawyer and turned this into an international incident. Anyway, so far, no clear answers have emerged and no one has been charged as of yet. All that said, at least to me, nothing really properly adds up here. In the early 19th century, if you were standing on the northernmost shores of Siberia, you might have witnessed something baffling. Each spring, flocks of polar bears would rise into the air and fly north, directly over the frozen sea, disappearing beyond the horizon. Then, in the autumn, they would return, this time with their young. Birds can't nest on barren ice, and the evidence of life itself seemed to demand the existence of a hidden land somewhere to the north. This was a warm, fertile oasis, nestled in the heart of the polar wasteland. This natural mystery was the first clue, the first whisper of a place that would haunt the Russian imagination for over 2 centuries, a phantom island known as Sannikov Land. The story of Sannikov Land, or Zemlya Sannikova in Russian, begins with a credible witness. Yakov Sannikov was a seasoned frontiersman, ivory hunter, and explorer who knew the Arctic as well as anyone alive. He had already discovered and charted real islands, proving he could distinguish land from ice. During a cartographic expedition between 1809 and 1810, Sannikov stood on the northern coast of the new Siberian islands and saw something new. In 1811, he reported it officially: the clear silhouette of land with high mountains, far to the north of Kotelny Island. This was a distinct geographical feature, and when combined with the inexplicable flight of the geese, Sannikov's report created a powerful, scientifically plausible hypothesis. Also, as I'm editing this now, I just realized I said polar bears instead of polar geese earlier, and you know what? I'm keeping it in. For decades, the idea simmered in the minds of Russian explorers. Then, in 1886, it found its great champion. Baron Edward von Toll was a respected Baltic German geologist in Russian service, a man of science obsessed with the Arctic's secrets. Like Sannikov before him, Toll was on an expedition to the new Siberian islands when, on a day of perfect visibility, he saw it. From the shore of Kotelny Island, he described the sharp outline of 4 mountains. He was so convinced that he even estimated its distance and speculated as to the mineral composition of the mountains. He spent the next decade campaigning relentlessly, arguing before the Imperial Academy of Sciences that finding this land was a matter of Russian national prestige. Finally, in 1900, he got his wish, and Toll was appointed leader of the Russian polar expedition, setting sail on the schooner Zarya with a dual mission. He was to conduct broad scientific research and, for Toll, to finally set foot on Sannikov Land itself. The expedition was grueling from the start, and the ship was plagued by leaks, and Toll clashed with his captain. They spent 2 punishing winters trapped in the pack ice, unable to break through to the island's supposed location. Interestingly, among the crew was a young, ambitious officer named Alexander Kolchak, who would be leading the white movement against the Reds just 2 decades later. After 2 years of frustration, Toll made a desperate gamble. In June 1902, he and 3 companions left the icebound Zarya. They would travel by kayak north to Bennett Island, a known outpost, and wait for the Zarya to pick them up when the ice finally cleared. The ship never made it as the ice was too severe, and the acting commander, following Toll's own contingency orders, was forced to sail south, leaving the 4 men stranded. The following spring, it was Kolchak, the future admiral, who led a daring rescue mission by whaleboat back to Bennett Island. He found Toll's camp, his scientific collections, and a final, heartbreaking note. Dated November 1902, it stated that the party was leaving the island and heading south by kayak, with provisions for only about 2 weeks. They were walking into the teeth of the polar night, a time of absolute darkness and treacherous, newly formed ice, and they were never seen again. The final chapter in the search came in the 1930s, when the Soviet Union, with its powerful new icebreakers and growing fleet of Arctic aircraft, decided to settle the question for good. In 1937, the icebreaker Sadko was dispatched with the explicit goal of finding Sannikov Land. In a turn of profound maritime irony, the Sadko, an icebreaker, also became trapped in the ice and had to be rescued by an icebreaker. The final nail in the coffin came in 1938 when Soviet Arctic pilots flew extensive surveys over the entire region. From the air there was no hiding, and they confirmed, beyond the shadow of a cat's ass, that Sannikov Land didn't exist. While this settled the historical tale of the Phantom Island, it did present a new scientific mystery in an attempt to explain what Sannikov and Toll saw. The first theory is that the island was real, but that by the 1930s, it was gone. Many islands in the New Siberian archipelago aren't solid rock, but are composed of a combination of permafrost and soil. These transient islands are incredibly vulnerable to coastal erosion, a process that is accelerating dramatically with rising Arctic temperatures. Notably, there's strong circumstantial evidence that this may be the case. The island of Mustak, in the same area, has seen extremely heavy coastline erosion at a rate of about 20 feet per year. It's entirely plausible that Sannikov Land was one of these icy islands, and it simply melted and crumbled into the sea. The second theory is that they were tricked by the light. The Arctic is famous for powerful optical illusions called superior mirages. To an observer, this creates a shimmering, distorted image of a distant landmass appearing to float in the sky where there is only water. Many geographers today believe that what Sannikov and Toll saw was a mirage of Bennett Island, a real island located much farther north. Notably, the scientific understanding of these mirages was limited at the time. In a weird twist of fate, despite not actually existing, or perhaps because it doesn't actually exist, Sannikov Land became a staple of Russian and Soviet culture in the 20th century. In 1926, the Soviet geologist Vladimir Obruchev wrote the science fiction novel aptly titled Sannikov Land. Obruchev, an expert on Siberia, gave the myth its enduring form, which continues on today, and has even morphed into a form of a conspiracy theory. Obruchev turned this non-existent island into an absolute paradise in Siberia in the Soviet popular imagination. He provided a clever scientific rationale for a warm Arctic utopia. The island was the caldera of a dormant volcano, its geothermal heat creating a lush, hidden world. He then populated it with mammoths and surviving Neanderthals. The book was wildly successful and was adapted into a movie in the 1970s. Notably, The author never claimed the work as anything but pure speculative fiction about a Siberian paradise. Despite this, some have argued that there is a real Arctic paradise in Sannikov land that the elites don't want anyone to know about for some reason. And trust me, there's totally nothing there, so don't go there looking for it under any circumstances whatsoever, because you definitely won't find a paradise full of mammoths. On the night of August 29th, 2002, 31-year-old Audrey Herron finished her nursing shift in Catskill, New York, and headed home. But she never arrived, leaving behind a dark mystery. Audrey, a mother of 3, left work around 11 p.m., wearing her dark green medical scrubs and a blue turtleneck, and drove off in her black 1994 Jeep Grand Cherokee. She planned to make the roughly 15-mile trip from the Greene County Healthcare Facility in Jefferson Heights back to her home in Freehold. This was a drive that should have taken at maximum 30 minutes. That late summer evening was rainy and foggy, which may have prompted Audrey to consider an alternate route for safety. By 11:30 p.m., her family expected her to walk through the door, but Audrey Herron vanished without a trace, along with the entire SUV she was driving. More than 20 years later, her disappearance remains an unsettling mystery. Audrey's last known actions were utterly routine. There were no signs of distress as she departed from work, and in fact, it had been a good day for Audrey. She'd received news of a substantial pay raise at work and had excitedly phoned her husband Jeff earlier to share the good news. When midnight came and went with no sign of Audrey, Jeff initially wasn't alarmed. According to some reports, he woke up briefly around 2 a.m. and noticed his wife still hadn't returned. But it wasn't until dawn that concern truly set in. By 6 o'clock in the morning on August 30th, Jeff began calling around. He phoned Audrey's mother, Shirley Olmsted, hoping perhaps Audrey had decided to spend the night at her mom's on a whim. It wasn't unusual for Audrey to occasionally stay over with her mother, but if she had, she would have let her husband know first. Shirley hadn't seen or heard from Audrey either, and within the next hour, worry turned into action, and Audrey was officially reported missing. Law enforcement wasted no time launching a search for the missing nurse and her vehicle. Police and volunteers fanned out across the area, covering nearly 120 miles of roads, backcountry routes, and trails looking for any sign of Audrey's black Jeep. Helicopters buzzed overhead as authorities scanned the thick forests and fields of Greene County from above. Missing person flyers bearing Audrey's face were posted throughout local communities, and everyone who may have seen her in the region would have been aware of her status. From the outset, there were no easy clues to be found. There were no broken guardrails along the route she likely took, no skid marks or debris, and not a single trace of the Jeep Grand Cherokee she was driving. Adding to concerns, Audrey's personal items had effectively gone silent as well, and her cell phone never pinged any towers, and her credit card saw no activity after she left work. The New York State Police soon classified Audrey's case as missing under suspicious circumstances, meaning foul play was a strong possibility. As in any disappearance, investigators took a hard look at those closest to Audrey. Naturally, Jeff Herron, Audrey's husband, was questioned extensively. Early news reports noted that Jeff initially declined a police request to take a polygraph test in the weeks after his wife went missing. Notably, as anyone familiar with true crime stories knows, there are a number of great reasons not to want to take a polygraph test, even if you're completely innocent. However, after he was labeled as uncooperative by the authorities, he eventually caved and took the lie detector test. After this test, and extensive searches of the family property on multiple occasions, the authorities advised that he was no longer a suspect in her disappearance. With the obvious suspect essentially ruled out, the cops began to dig deeper into Audrey's life, and what they found was disturbingly ordinary. There were no secret affairs, no hidden problems with substances, no clandestine entanglements with shady individuals. She was a great employee and a stellar mother of 3 children, and everyone who the authorities interviewed insisted she would never intentionally leave her kids behind. Interestingly, her children remembered her as such a good mother that, according to an interview from 2025 I was able to find, 2 of them were inspired to become nurses as well. In the absence of hard evidence, numerous theories have emerged about what could have happened on Audrey's drive home. Investigators and family have grappled with possibilities ranging from accident to abduction. One of the first possibilities considered was that Audrey wrecked her Jeep that night, skidding off the road due to the foggy, rainy conditions. Perhaps she took a back road detour to avoid bad weather and ended up in a ravine or a body of water where her vehicle simply hasn't been spotted. This theory gained traction because it's exceedingly rare for a vehicle as large as a Jeep Grand Cherokee to completely vanish without a trace. Despite extensive searches by ground and air, no trace has ever been found, leading some to doubt a simple accident. Still, police have treated this possibility seriously, and even in recent years they have sent dive teams to search local waters. For instance, in May 2022, the New York State Police Underwater Recovery Team scoured 3 Greene County water bodies for evidence of Audrey's Jeep, but came up empty-handed. The complete lack of any debris or oil slicks after countless searches has made the accident theory seem less likely to many, but it can't be ruled out. Ultimately, the area she disappeared in has numerous bodies of water, and a search of 3 lakes is nothing in the grand scheme of things. Some have considered the possibility that she met with foul play at the hands of someone lying in wait. According to Shirley Olmsted, Audrey's mother, Audrey had a habit of leaving her car door unlocked. This theory suggests that someone snuck in and lay in wait with the intent of doing serious harm to Audrey. Under this theory, this person may have been a stalker who had become fixated on Audrey, perhaps completely unbeknownst to her. Another theory is that Audrey was the victim of a chance encounter with the wrong person on the road. This area of upstate New York is generally peaceful and quiet, but it's not impossible that a stranger could have crossed paths with Audrey after she left work. One possibility is that she might have stopped if she saw someone in distress on the roadside, given her helpful nursing instincts, only to fall into a trap. Alternatively, a stranger could have intentionally caused her to stop or forced her vehicle off the road. However, without any 911 calls, witness sightings, or evidence left behind, this theory is impossible to substantiate. Although never labeled a suspect, Jeff Herron has unavoidably been part of the conversation in Audrey's case. While there has been continued focus on Jeff amongst online sleuths, the reality is that the authorities have confirmed that there is no evidence of wrongdoing by the husband. Notably, he didn't help in the search efforts, which some people find highly unusual, and quite honestly, I do as well. All that said, having covered so many of these cases, I find that in cases where the husband did it, he's usually very much out there and involved in the search effort. After all, this serves a dual purpose of appearing to be the perfect grieving spouse, along with also obtaining intel about the efforts made by search teams. The investigation into Audrey Herron's disappearance remains active, albeit as a cold case. Law enforcement agencies, led by the New York State Police, continue to follow leads as they emerge. In 1946, the quiet communities along Oregon's Willamette River were shaken by a gruesome discovery that would become one of the state's most perplexing cold cases. Over the course of that year, dismembered remains surfaced in and around the river near Oak Grove, just south of Portland. The victim, an unidentified woman, came to be known only as the Oak Grove Jane Doe, and in the years following, her remains went missing. Nearly 80 years later, her case remains unsolved, but advances in forensic science and persistent investigators are still striving to piece together what happened. And trust me when I say it, this case just had the most unexpected and bizarre twist in September 2025, which will almost certainly lead to her identity being restored. On April 12, 1946, three friends walking along the east bank of the Willamette River near Oak Grove stumbled upon a strange burlap sack caught in the river. Drawn by curiosity and a foul odor, they dragged the bundle ashore, initially thinking it might contain drowned animals. To their horror, inside they found the torso of a human female along with clothing, all tightly wrapped with rope and wire and weighted down. This shocking find was quickly reported to authorities, and a full-on search of the area began. The very next day, April 13, 1946, more body parts surfaced. Two fishermen at Willamette Falls, a few miles upriver, retrieved another burlap bundle that had been floating near a lock system. Inside were the victim's arms and a thigh, also severed and weighted down in similar fashion to the first package. The fishermen later revealed they had seen that burlap parcel bobbing in the water for weeks, but only upon hearing news of the torso did they realize its significance. Investigators scoured the muddy banks near the falls and even made plaster casts of footprints found near where the bundle might have been thrown into the water. The search for the woman's remains continued throughout 1946 as spring turned to summer and fall. In late July 1946, roughly 3 months after the initial discoveries, the victim's other thigh was found floating under a bridge near Oregon City, further downstream. Around the same time, detectives recovered bundles of women's clothing from the nearby Clackamas River, a tributary of the Willamette. The scattering of body parts and personal items across two rivers led police to suspect the perpetrator had tried to dispose of evidence in multiple places to confuse investigators. In September, there was a report of what appeared to be a fragment of scalp retrieved. Finally, on October 13, 1946, the victim's head was discovered in the river, not far from where the torso had initially been found. This package, like the others, had been weighted and wrapped, and was spotted by a local couple walking along the water's edge. Despite extensive searches, the woman's hands and feet were never recovered. By year's end, authorities had collected nearly the entire body of the unknown victim, in pieces, from the Oregon waterways. From the moment the remains were found, police and medical experts worked to assemble a profile of the victim and clues to her death. Initially, she was described as being in her late teens or early 20s by a local coroner. However, the authorities had some doubts and sent the remains to a forensic pathologist. His analysis revealed the victim was actually a middle-aged Caucasian woman, likely between 40 and 50 years old with a moderate build. This further medical examination uncovered disturbing details about the crime. The lower portion of the torso had unusual burn marks that appeared to be caused by a blowtorch. Once the skull was recovered and examined, the cause was determined. The victim had suffered a massive blunt force trauma injury to the head. Authorities believed that the dismemberment took place after this occurred, but given the signs of violence, they couldn't say for sure. Notably, within days of the torso's discovery, the case attracted not only concerned citizens but also pranksters and false confessors. On April 14, 1946, a man in a nearby town phoned police claiming he knew the victim's identity and where the crime had happened. This dramatic confession turned out to be a hoax by an attention seeker, which authorities quickly dismissed as a cruel prank. The case captured some national headlines, which only encouraged more of this sort of behavior, and credible leads were non-existent. Evidence collection in the 40s lacked many of the advantages of modern forensics, yet the investigators did what they could. They traced the burlap sacks and ropes for any identifying marks, and examined the woman's clothing for laundry labels or distinctive features. Despite these attempts, the investigation ended up stalling out, and by the early 50s, the Oak Grove Jane Doe case had gone cold. Crucially, many physical pieces of evidence disappeared from police custody. At some point in the 1950s, the victim's remains and other critical evidence were lost or destroyed without any clear documentation and for no apparent reason. This included the bones and skull of the Jane Doe herself, which had been retained for analysis. How such evidence went missing remains an unsettling mystery of its own, and one that has led to rumors of a cover-up, but I'll come to that in a moment. With no body to examine and only old case files to work from, investigators in later years had little to go on. Despite these challenges, the case was never completely forgotten. In 2004, the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office formally reopened the Oak Grove Jane Doe investigation, treating it as an active cold case review. Detectives revisited the old reports and searched for any remaining evidence that might have been overlooked. Unfortunately, they ran into the same problem of the evidence simply having been destroyed. Then a breakthrough came from an unexpected direction: an old cemetery record. In September 2025, nearly 79 years after the slaying, officials with the Oregon State Medical Examiner's Office made a startling discovery. While combing through historical burial documents and even crowdsourced grave databases, they found a reference to an unidentified woman buried in 1951. The name on the headstone indicated that she was, quote, "Unknown Woman, 1946." The burial site was in Mountain View Cemetery in Oregon City, not far from where the last of the remains had been found. This clue suggested that some portion of the Jane Doe's remains had indeed been interred locally, presumably after the initial investigation concluded. Acting quickly on this lead, authorities located the grave and, on September 22, 2025, exhumed the remains of the woman in the grave for forensic analysis. This exhumation marked the first tangible progress in the case in almost 80 years. Given this development, I anticipate that the authorities will be able to use modern genetic genealogical techniques to give this woman her identity back after 80 years. With her identity returned, this will also present a unique opportunity to solve this cold case. There are a lot of sensationalistic theories out there on who this Jane Doe was in life. One of the most discussed theories in recent years is that the victim may have been Anna Schrader, a Portland woman who indeed vanished around 1946. Anna Schrader's background suggests she was a one-time police informant and the mistress of a Portland cop in the 1920s. According to some researchers, she had publicly claimed she had kept records of all the corruption in the Portland Police Department. Intriguingly, in April 1946, the same time the Jane Doe's remains began appearing, a classified ad ran in the Oregonian newspaper seeking information on Ann Schrader. And no, you didn't hear me incorrectly there. I said Ann and not Anna. It's unclear if these two are the same individual or not, and Schrader isn't an uncommon name. And personally, I think the name rocks. I'll just insert a little pause there to let that one sink in. I suspect that sometime over the next year, we'll have word on whether this Jane Doe was Anna Schrader or not. For now, though, we have to play the waiting game while those forensic wizards do their thing. Hey everyone, Jimmy reminding you to like and subscribe and to tap the notification bell and click the share button and send it around to your friends and family. Also, don't forget to check out my other channel, Lazy Chill True Crime, if you're into solved crime cases. On a clear, sunny morning in March 1876, Residents of rural Bath County, Kentucky witnessed one of the strangest downpours in history. It was a shower of meat falling from the sky. Around 11 on March 3rd, a farmer's wife named Mrs. Crouch was outdoors making soap when she suddenly saw chunks of raw flesh plummet to the ground around her. For a few minutes, pieces of bloody meat, some as light as snowflakes, others several inches across, rained over the Crouch farm, sticking to fences and grass in a broad area. Stunned and frightened, the Crouches suspected this uncanny deluge might be a divine omen or supernatural warning. By the time this bizarre Kentucky meat shower ended, it had strewn the ground with what looked like butcher's scraps across their farm. The farmers initially thought that the meat was beef, but they decided to take it over to a local butcher. The butcher in turn said that it definitely wasn't beef, and that while it looked like mutton, it didn't smell like it at all. A hunter, catching word of what had happened, asked to inspect the meat, and came to the conclusion that it was from a bear. Word of mouth about the meat shower was spreading rapidly, and it would soon hit the local news and then go national in the New York Times. From there, the meat shower captured the attention of legitimate scientists, and a number of samples were sent around the country for further analysis. Early explanations for the meat shower ranged from scientific curiosity to the bizarre. One initial hypothesis was that the material wasn't meat at all, but rather dried frog eggs or spawn that had been whisked into the air by winds and then fallen back down. This idea lost traction once microscopic examination revealed organized muscle fibers, which was clear evidence of animal tissue, not amorphous amphibian jelly. Another proposal suggested in a journal article that the meat was actually nostoc, a type of gelatinous algae-like bacteria that can swell into fleshy lumps after rain. However, this theory was quickly undermined by the facts of the case. The meat shower occurred under clear skies with no rain to trigger nostoc, and several scientists found that the samples undeniably had the cellular structure of animal flesh. In short, whatever fell on the Crouch farm was genuine meat, not a plant or pond slime masquerading as meat. As more samples arrived at laboratories, researchers began to characterize exactly what kind of meat had fallen and from where. Before long, investigators arrived at a plausible answer. The leading theory is that the meat had fallen from the stomachs of vultures flying overhead. Bath County was home to scavenging birds like turkey vultures, and these birds are notorious for vomiting their food as a defensive tactic or when they need to lighten their load. In fact, if one vulture in a flock regurgitates, it can trigger a chain reaction causing its companions to disgorge as well. In 1876, local experts pointed out that this buzzard blast scenario neatly fit the evidence. A flock of vultures might have been feasting on a dead animal, say a sheep, which would explain the mutton-like smell, and then something startled them. The startled birds then collectively regurgitated the half-digested meal mid-flight onto the Crouch farm. The gory payload would then scatter in the wind and fall to the ground as a rain of flesh and organs. Though no one actually saw the birds overhead at the time, the notion that a flock of nauseated vultures caused the incident was considered the most reasonable explanation. Other common explanations at the time focused on it being a supernatural event, or even if it wasn't supernatural, that it was an omen of things to come. And honestly, there's something extremely ominous about a sheep carcass raining down from the sky in bits regardless. I seriously wonder what an augur from Roman antiquity would have had to say about that sort of event. Notably, the meat from this event has been preserved, and as genetic testing improves on degraded specimens, we will one day know the origin of the meat. That, of course, doesn't prove the vulture theory, but it will provide some answer to exactly what animal rained down on the Crouch farm in the late 19th century. On July 18, 1988, 64-year-old Jane Gilboy, a longtime resident of Franklin, Massachusetts, was found brutally slain in her own home. Despite the passage of more than 35 years, authorities continue to actively pursue leads in this unsolved case, determined to obtain justice for Jane. Jane Gilboy was by all accounts an ordinary, hard-working woman. She lived in Franklin with her long-term boyfriend, held a job as a bookkeeper at Camger Chemical in nearby Norfolk, and also worked part-time keeping books for a local liquor store. Just prior to the tragedy, she had enjoyed a weekend getaway on Cape Cod with a friend, returning home Sunday evening, July 17th, 1988. The next day, Monday, July 18th, began routinely for Jane. She went to work as usual and clocked out around 4 p.m. to drive home, following her normal route through Norfolk into Franklin. As was her habit, she stopped at the Horace Mann Plaza in Franklin to pick up a newspaper and some items before heading home. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary during her commute, and it appeared to be a typical summer afternoon for Jane. Sometime shortly after 4:15 p.m., Jane arrived at her house at 783 King Street in Franklin and parked in her usual spot in the driveway. She entered through the rear door of her home, likely carrying the newspaper and items she'd just bought, and stepped inside. Tragically, Jane only made it a few steps into her living room before she was violently attacked from behind. Evidence later showed that she was ambushed almost immediately after entering. The assailant struck with brutal force, inflicting a severe beating and slashing Jane's throat during the assault. Her fully clothed body was discovered on the floor, with her house keys dropped near her hand. It was Jane's boyfriend who found her later that same day. He arrived home in the early evening and stumbled upon the horrific scene, then urgently called for an ambulance shortly after 6 o'clock. First responders rushed to the house, but it was immediately clear that Jane was already deceased and that her death was the result of extreme violence. Aside from the devastation wrought on Jane herself, the crime scene didn't initially reveal many clues. Notably, the only item reported missing from the home was Jane's purse. There were no obvious signs of ransacking or a prolonged struggle throughout the house, and the attack had been swift and focused. The fact that Jane's purse was gone raised the possibility of a robbery, but nothing else of value appeared to be taken. Franklin police, along with the Massachusetts State Police, launched an intensive investigation immediately. From the outset, it was a challenging case, and there was no known eyewitness to the attack, and, in the immediate aftermath, no obvious suspect emerged. Investigators naturally interviewed Jane's boyfriend and others close to her, but no one was charged or officially named a suspect in those early days. In fact, even decades later, authorities have never publicly identified any individual as a prime suspect or person of interest in this case. Notably, Jane's boyfriend was at work at the time of the attack and appears to have had an airtight alibi. At any rate, even if he was the responsible party, which all evidence says he was not, he passed away a few years later. Over time, as the trail grew cold, the case became what authorities prefer to call unresolved rather than truly closed. Detectives continued to work the case for years, periodically reviewing evidence and re-interviewing anyone who might know something. A major development in the Gilboy investigation came in 2003, about 15 years after the attack. Detectives decided to submit a blood sample from the crime scene for DNA testing, hoping that modern forensic science might provide a break in the case. At the time, officials were tight-lipped about specifics, saying only that the results were, quote, not as expected. In the immortal words of Bart Simpson, what an odd thing to say. This cryptic statement suggests that the sample was too degraded, or it turned out to be Jane's, or it didn't match any profile on record, and more on that last point in a second. Whatever the case, the DNA analysis did not lead to an arrest or any public breakthrough. Now I have a completely speculative idea on why they may have issued this statement, and I'm not really basing this on anything here. But I suspect that there's a non-zero chance that there may have been a DNA sample from an unknown woman recovered from the scene. Such brutal random attacks are very rarely committed by a female attacker, and given how tight-lipped the investigators are, I suspect they may not want to release this information. That said, again, this idea is completely speculative on my part, but it would explain the very unusual and cryptic behavior of the investigators. For example, if it was from her boyfriend, who was then deceased, I imagine they would have just come out and released that information, even if it was unexpected. With no arrests and scant publicly revealed evidence, the slaying of Jane Gilboy has prompted speculation about who eliminated her and why. Investigators have kept many details confidential, but they have provided some insight that guides the leading theories. Notably, the extreme violence of the attack and the relatively minor apparent theft suggest that robbery was not the primary motive. The police have gone on record as believing this to be the case, and it tracks well, since you really don't see this level of brutality in thefts in general. Many believe instead that it was a targeted personal attack perpetrated on Jane. This is the theory that I personally subscribe to as well. Under this theory, the ferocity of the beating and throat slashing indicates rage or intent beyond what would be needed to incapacitate a victim for the purposes of a purse snatching. This indicates that there may have been someone in Jane's life who bore an incredible grudge against her. However, the investigators are extremely tight-lipped about this case, which makes it hard to analyze whether this was the case or not. Others have speculated that the attack might have been the work of a stalker who essentially chose to target Jane at random. What is known is that the attacker clearly struck immediately as she entered the house. This suggests to some that the attacker may have been extremely familiar with her schedule and lurking nearby the entrance to her house. After all these years, Jane Gilboy's case remains unsolved, but it is far from a forgotten cold case. Investigators today emphasize that they consider it an active but unresolved case, meaning they are waiting for the right evidence or tip to finally crack it. Modern forensic techniques may offer renewed hope, and it's always possible that the cryptic surprise from the first DNA attempt in 2003 was that it was too degraded. Modern forensic technology has come a long way since that time, and it's possible that this may be the clue that closes out this tragedy once and for all. For centuries in the foothills of the Pyrenees, in southern France and North Spain, an extraordinary secret lay hidden in plain sight. It revealed itself only when patterns in local family trees began to emerge. These families came from long lines of humble carpenters, basket makers, and rope makers, almost always relegated to the wrong parts of town. Beneath the surface was a 1,000-year-old story of a cursed and unique people. They were known as the Cagos, and their history is one of relentless stigma. Despite being genetically, linguistically, and religiously indistinguishable from their neighbors, they were cast out and treated as untouchables. For nearly a millennium, the only thing setting them apart was their descent from other Cagos. Their story raises haunting questions. Who were the Cagos, and why were they condemned so completely for reasons that not even their persecutors could clearly define? To be a Cago was to live a life governed by invisible boundaries and ritualized humiliation. From birth until death, every aspect of their existence was segregated, policed by a complex system of rules designed to enforce their status as quote-unquote unclean. The physical separation began with their homes. Cagos were confined to their own ghettos, which were invariably situated on the least desirable land. These were neighborhoods outside the main village walls, often on the far side of a river or in malarial marshlands. These areas were seen as being a safe distance from the markets, taverns, and shops of the rest of the population. This physical distance was reinforced by a litany of prohibitions built on a logic of contamination. It was believed that the Cagos were pestilential, their very touch capable of poisoning the world around them. They were forbidden from walking the common roads barefoot, lest they taint the earth. They couldn't touch the parapets of bridges, drink from public fountains, or enter taverns where other people drank. To handle food or wine in the market was a crime, and they were barred from owning livestock or farming the land. In one horrific instance in the early 18th century, a Cago who dared to try to farm was punished by having his feet impaled. There are many such instances of this disturbing cruelty perpetrated on these people by their neighbors. To ensure they could be identified at a glance, Cagos were forced to wear a badge. And I need to emphasize at this point that they looked identical to the people who surrounded them in every way, though some rumors would say this was only because of their dark magic. But back to the badge. This was a piece of red or yellow cloth, cut into the shape of a goose or duck's foot, sewn conspicuously onto their clothing. This mark, which earned them the derogatory nickname canards, or ducks en français, and served as a constant visible reminder of their status. Anyone found without their badge faced fines, or the confiscation of their clothes, or potentially even worse. In some regions, the parallels with another feared group were made explicit. Cagos were required to carry a wooden rattle, or claquette, to announce their approach, the same tool used by lepers to warn others to keep their distance. This practice cemented the association with disease in the public mind, even when there was no evidence to support it. Barred from nearly all professions, especially those involving food or agriculture, the Cagos were funneled into a narrow set of trades. They became the community's woodworkers, carpenters, barrel makers, rope makers, and tellingly, coffin makers. They were the hewers of wood for the towns they lived in. This restriction created a profound irony, and Cagos became highly skilled craftsmen, particularly as carpenters. Their labor was in high demand, and they were often the ones who built the magnificent wooden roofs and doors of the very churches that would become the sites of their greatest humiliation. They were simultaneously indispensable to the community for their skills and utterly rejected by it as people, a paradox that highlights the contradictory logic of their persecution. Nowhere was the Cagos' status as inclusive outcasts more apparent than in the house of God. Their treatment in church remains their most tangible legacy, etched into the very stone of dozens of chapels. They were forbidden from using the main entrance, instead being forced through small, low side doors. These doors required them to stoop over and virtually crawl into church, where their humiliation continued. They were confined to the coldest, darkest corners of the church, separated from the main congregation by a wooden railing. The ultimate degradation came during communion. They were often forbidden from partaking at all, especially by priests who had grown up in regions with these people. When priests would pass the Eucharist to them, it was a disturbing spectacle that caused disgust to outsiders who observed it. The Eucharist was passed to them on the end of a long wooden spoon or stick, as if feeding a dangerous animal. For centuries, historians have tried to pinpoint a reason for the relentless persecution of the Cagos. The sheer variety and outlandishness of the theories reveal more about the nature of prejudice than they do about the Cagos themselves. The search for a single origin is a hunt for a rational explanation for an irrational hatred. The most common and enduring explanation was that Cagos were the descendants of medieval lepers. This theory seemed logical, as it would explain the obsession with contamination, and the similarities in treatment, such as the use of rattles. However, the historical record tells a different story, and hospital records of the time in southern France indicated that they forbid entry to Cagos, whether they were sick or not. The implication of these records is that it was accepted that there were Cagos who definitely weren't sick. Another set of theories cast the Cagos as the descendants of defeated enemies, their cursed status a kind of inherited treason. One theory suggests that they were the remnants of Muslim armies from the 8th century, though no evidence supports this. For instance, the names of Cagos are identical to those of their neighbors, and they adhered to all the same traditions, showing no signs of having originally been converts. Another theory suggests they are survivors of the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathar heresy. This explanation was strategically used by the Cagos themselves in a 1514 appeal to Pope Leo X, advising that they were very orthodox in their Catholic practice. However, like the other theories on their origin, this one crumbles under scrutiny. Historical records show Cago communities existed long before the Cathar heresy and in regions where it never took hold. Where history failed to provide a reason, myth and folklore rushed in to fill the void. Fantastical stories cast the Cagos as a people cursed by God himself. They were said to be descended from the carpenters who built the cross for Christ's crucifixion, which appeared to provide an explanation for why they were so good with wood. Notably, the description of what a Cago looked like is wildly inconsistent. Some said that they exclusively had blonde hair and blue eyes and were tall, while others said they were dark and swarthy and tended to be shorter. Others said that their true appearance was much more disturbing and that they had the ability to use powerful magic to alter their appearance and fit in with the regular population. In essence, though, the purpose of these stories wasn't to describe reality as it existed, but to dehumanize a class of people. After stripping away the layers of myth, failed historical theories, and rationalizations, we are left with a stark and unsettling conclusion. There was no original sin, and the only consistent, verifiable reason a person was a Cago was because their parents were Cagos. Their persecution was a tautology. They were hated because they were Cagos, and they were Cagos because they were hated. This system was maintained not by any visible difference, but by the meticulous record-keeping of local communities, particularly parish priests, who logged every birth and baptism. A Cago who moved to a new village could be easily identified by a letter from their former priest, and thus the persecution would continue. Despite centuries of oppression, the Cagos weren't merely passive victims. As mentioned briefly, in 1514 they banded together and appealed to the Pope, an Italian, who appears to have been confused as to why they were being persecuted. Cagos only existed as a class in southern France and in Basque country under the Spanish crown, and he was likely unfamiliar with them as a class. The Pope issued a decree that Cagos were good Christians and ought not to be treated any differently either in church or in society in general. It's unclear how much impact this had on the ground at the time, since local parish priests weren't writing up reports on this class of outcasts. Further, of course, parish priests weren't supposed to be discriminating against them to begin with, so the Pope's decree was really just a restatement of canon law as it stood anyway. In France, Cagos went before regional parliaments to challenge their segregation from the rest of the populace. One famous case in Toulouse dragged on for 40 years before the court finally decreed in 1600 that the Cagos were not lepers and shouldn't be treated as such. Interestingly, this also provides one data point to indicate that after it became clear that the Pope didn't want them to be discriminated against on religious grounds, the reasons changed. They were simply treated as lepers, and as such, by the logic of the time, they needed to be kept apart, despite what the Pope said about their practice of Catholicism. The true turning point came with the French Revolution in 1789. The revolution's ideals of liberty and equality legally abolished all discriminatory laws against the Cagots, granting them, at least on paper, the full rights of citizenship. But the Cagots understood something profound about their condition. Their curse wasn't just a matter of law or social custom, it was written down in ink. Their oppression was bureaucratic, enshrined in the baptismal records and parish registers that had tracked their quote-unquote unclean lineage for centuries. During the chaos of the revolution, Cagots across the region took direct action. They stormed town halls and parish archives, seeking out the documents which proved their status and burned them. This was a targeted assault on the administrative machinery of their persecution. By destroying the official records, they were destroying the state's ability to see and enforce their hereditary status ever again. This act of liberation through erasure proved more effective than all the papal proclamations and royal decrees that had come before it. The destruction of the archives, combined with the new legal equality granted by the revolution, finally allowed the walls of the ghettos to crumble. Through the 19th and into the 20th century, the Cagots began to slowly assimilate. Intermarriage with non-Cagots became possible, and families moved away, changed their names, and shed the identity that had brought them nothing but suffering. The distinct Cagot culture, forged in the crucible of persecution, simply vanished. In the end, the mystery of why these people were persecuted remains entirely unsolved. In the early 1980s, Roger Wheeler spent millions buying a business that he hoped would be the basis for his sports empire. What he didn't know is that this purchase meant that he had entered into a fatal entanglement with the Boston Mob and Whitey Bulger, one of the most feared gangsters in American history. Wheeler was a self-made multimillionaire who came from humble beginnings, who had established himself as a well-known figure in Tulsa, Oklahoma. By 1981, the 55-year-old father of five had built a business empire, notably as the chairman of Telex, a communications company that employed thousands in the Tulsa area. Wheeler had a reputation as a shrewd, confident businessman who thrived on competition and always seemed to come out on top. Beyond Telex, he had diversified his ventures, and a few years earlier, he made a fateful decision. He purchased World High Lie, a Florida-based gaming and sports entertainment company. At first glance, World High Lie might have seemed like an exciting new opportunity. High Lie is a fast-paced sport that was popular in parts of Florida and New England, drawing crowds who enjoyed betting on the games. As the new owner and president, Wheeler aimed to legitimize and grow the business and attract mainstream audiences to the game. However, what he didn't know was that the organization he purchased was harboring an extremely dark secret. Behind the scenes, an organized crime group from Boston, the Winter Hill Gang, led by the notorious James Whitey Bulger, had infiltrated the company. They were running a lucrative skimming scheme, siphoning off cash from the operation's proceeds, particularly from parking lot revenues and concessions. The scheme was made possible by an inside man, H. Paul Rico, a former FBI agent who had retired and taken a job as head of security for the organization. As a former FBI man, Roger Wheeler initially trusted Rico implicitly in what would turn out to be a grave mistake right from the start. Rico had once cultivated Bulger and other mobsters as informants in Boston, and now he was helping them line their pockets by stealing from Wheeler's new venture. Roger Wheeler wasn't someone to let money slip away unnoticed, and within a couple of years of buying World High Lie, he grew suspicious. He noticed irregularities in the financial records, profits that didn't add up, and cash that vanished before it could be reported. Wheeler voiced concerns that something wasn't right at the company, and he even confided to family that he was considering selling the business, sensing deeper problems. In early 1981, he fired several key employees at the company's Connecticut and Florida operations, including financial officers, suspecting them of involvement in an embezzlement ring. He sent his own son on a discreet trip to Florida to inspect the books and the computer systems for evidence of theft. Wheeler's relentless probing into the company's affairs signaled to Rico that the scheme was in jeopardy. The Winter Hill Gang ended up catching wind of this and decided to eliminate the problem at its source. On May 27, 1981, a sunny Wednesday afternoon in Tulsa, Roger stuck to his routine. Each week, he enjoyed a round of golf at the exclusive Southern Hills Country Club, where he was a prominent member. That day, Wheeler played golf with friends, had his usual drink at the clubhouse, and then headed to the parking lot to leave. He walked to his Cadillac, likely tired from the game, but relaxed in the familiar comfort of his club. As he sat in the driver's seat, something unexpected and horrifying happened. A man approached the car and, without any warning or chance for Wheeler to react, raised a weapon and fired a single blast at point-blank range through the window. The bullet struck Roger Wheeler between the eyes. Club patrons nearby heard a loud crack echo across the lot, but no one immediately investigated what was going on. By the time anyone realized what happened, the shooter had calmly walked away. Within minutes, club staff and friends rushed to Wheeler's Cadillac. They found him slumped in the front seat, unresponsive. Paramedics and police were called, but there was little anyone could do. Roger Wheeler died at the scene, the victim of a professional job. Tulsa police launched an investigation immediately, but they faced a perplexing mystery. Who would want Roger Wheeler dead, and why? Initially, detectives looked for local enemies or business disputes that might have led to this brutal act. Wheeler was powerful and straightforward. Perhaps someone held a grudge from a business deal gone bad. Yet, from the start, signs pointed away from the typical motives. This was a meticulous, calculated slaying by an unknown assailant who appeared to vanish without a trace. One of the Tulsa detectives assigned to the case quickly sensed this wasn't a simple local crime. The method, a single shot between the eyes, and the lack of obvious personal motive, suggested a pro had been retained. There were composite sketches made from witness descriptions of two middle-aged men, one believed to be the shooter, the other the driver. But these yielded no immediate matches. The two men wore the same glasses, the same style of beards, and had their hair done in a similar way, suggesting that they may have been members of an organized crime syndicate. Detectives learned from Wheeler's family and colleagues that he had been worried about the Florida operation of his high-lie business. When they dug into this angle, they uncovered evidence of skimming at the company's Connecticut venue. The fraudsters had skimmed money from parking and concessions in a way that pointed to a sophisticated organized fraud. In the early 1980s, the notion that the Boston mob could reach into the heart of Oklahoma seemed far-fetched to some. Despite these suspicions, the case went cold, and a cloud of fear and silence hung over anyone with knowledge. Potential informants were terrified, and for good reason. In the months following Wheeler's death, other gangland executions hinted at a wider issue in the high-lie world. One was Brian Halloran, a low-level Boston criminal who reportedly approached the FBI claiming he had information on Wheeler's slaying and that a man named John Callahan was involved. Halloran was executed on a South Boston waterfront in May 1982, alongside an innocent friend who just happened to give him a ride that night. The other was John Callahan himself, the former president of World High Lie who had sold the business to Roger Wheeler. In August 1982, Callahan's body was found stuffed in the trunk of his Cadillac in a Miami airport parking garage. It appeared that anyone who knew too much about the skimming operation was being systematically eliminated, but unsurprisingly, no one seemed willing to talk about it anymore. As the 1980s progressed, the Roger Wheeler case remained unsolved, frustrating his family and the Tulsa police. Eventually, Tulsa detectives began to suspect that the very people who should have been their allies were hindering the investigation. The FBI had jurisdiction over interstate crime and organized crime, and given the emerging Boston mob connection, one would expect federal agents to be deeply involved in helping Tulsa police. However, they were largely kept in the dark about the investigation. Unbeknownst to Tulsa detectives at the time, this reluctance had a sinister explanation. Agents in the FBI's Boston office were themselves compromised. It later emerged that certain Boston FBI agents had extraordinarily close relationships with Whitey Bulger. Bulger, incredibly, had been acting as an FBI informant since the 1970s, feeding agents information on rival gangs while he was effectively given license to commit crimes. Throughout the investigation, one name kept surfacing: H. Paul Rico, the former FBI agent turned World High Lie security chief. By 1982, Tulsa detectives suspected that Rico might have played a role in Wheeler's demise, and that the FBI may be compromised. That said, at the time, more level-headed investigators in Tulsa dismissed this as a virtual impossibility. As time went on, though, those suspicions were bolstered as the truth about the Winter Hill Gang's infiltration of the FBI trickled out in the late 1990s. John Connolly, a Boston FBI agent who was a handler for Bulger, was arrested and later convicted of multiple charges related to his corruption and protection of Bulger. Investigations by the Justice Department exposed that Bulger had been shielded for years. This shift finally gave the Roger Wheeler case new momentum after almost 2 decades. What had once been dismissed as a crazy theory that Boston mobsters ordered a hit done in Tulsa and that FBI insiders might have been complicit was proving to be reality. And with Bulger on the run since 1995 to avoid an indictment, some of his former cronies began to talk, hoping to avoid life or the chair. The breakthrough in the Wheeler case came as the new millennium dawned. In the late 1990s and 2000, federal prosecutors and investigators managed to flip some key Winter Hill Gang members. One of them was Johnny Martirano, a feared enforcer who had been part of Bulger's inner circle. Martirano had been implicated in a string of gangland slayings. Facing the possibility of the chair or life behind bars, he agreed to cooperate. In a plea deal, Martirano admitted to carrying out over 20 slayings at the behest of the crew, and one of those was Roger Wheeler's. He revealed the chain of events behind it all. Whitey Bulger and his closest allies were alarmed that Wheeler's investigation was getting too close to their skimming operation, and decided that Wheeler had to be eliminated. Martirano flew to Oklahoma under an alias, and it was Rico who helped by providing inside information of the details of Wheeler's habits and schedule. On that fateful day at Southern Hills, Martirano lay in wait and executed the plan. He then slipped away, returned the rental car, and flew out, leaving Tulsa authorities baffled. In March 2001, nearly 20 years after the slaying, a Tulsa grand jury finally indicted all those responsible for the slaying of Roger Wheeler. By that time, 2 other men allegedly central to the crime were already dead. By way of refresher, Brian Halloran, the low-level Boston career criminal, had been snuffed out in 1982 on that South Boston shoreline, while John Callahan, the former World High Lie president, was stuffed into a trunk in Miami. Bulger, the mastermind of the operation, was still a fugitive when the indictments came down, and he had slipped away in 1995 after a tip-off about pending charges. Another stunning development was the indictment of former agent Paul Rico in 2003. At age 78, Rico was arrested and charged with aiding in the slaying of Roger Wheeler. Rico maintained his innocence, and he would never face trial. He died of natural causes in 2004 while in custody awaiting proceedings. Notably, Martirano, with 20 bodies to his name, including Roger Wheeler's, was given only a 15-year sentence as part of his plea bargain. In June 2011, 30 years after Roger Wheeler was slain in that Tulsa parking lot, news broke that Whitey Bulger had been captured. He was arrested in Santa Monica, California, where he had been living in hiding with his longtime girlfriend. Bulger's arrest made headlines worldwide after years of being one of the most high-profile wanted people in the country. Federal authorities decided to try all his cases together, as is usual in such complex interjurisdictional matters. In 2013, Whitey Bulger went on trial for the slaying of Roger Wheeler, amongst numerous others. The jury found he had participated in Wheeler's slaying, and he was sentenced to 2 life terms plus 5 years, ensuring the 83-year-old mobster would die in prison. Bulger would go on to meet a violent and horrific end behind bars in 2018 at the hands of his fellow inmates, his life of crime finally having caught up to him in his old age. The Sakara bird is a small, carved wooden object that has captivated historians and aviation enthusiasts alike for over a century. Discovered in 1898 during the excavation of a tomb at Saqqara, this intriguing artifact dates back over 2 millennia to around 200 BC. It resembles a stylized bird, with outstretched wings measuring about 7 centimeters across and a lightweight body weighing less than 1/10 of a pound. Crafted from sturdy sycamore wood and originally mounted on a rod, the figurine immediately stood out as a curious find. At first glance, it seems like a simple bird carving, but its unusually plane-like form has puzzled and inspired speculation ever since. In form, it resembles a bird of prey. The carving is sleek and almost aerodynamic, with flat, horizontal wings as if poised in glide. The head is carved with a hooked beak, reminiscent of a falcon, a creature sacred to the ancient Egyptians. The tail is broad and level, though the artifact notably lacks legs or painted detail. Its craftsmanship is simple yet well-proportioned, suggesting the maker had a good sense of balance. Today, this little wooden bird is displayed in Cairo's Egyptian Museum, where its plane-like silhouette continues to fascinate visitors. Visitors can find it on the museum's upper floor among other animal figurines, yet this particular piece stands out as a mystery of its own. Without inscriptions or records, archaeologists have had to speculate on why this miniature bird was made. One idea is that it served a ceremonial or symbolic function. Falcons were sacred in Egypt, representing sky gods like Horus and Ra, so a falcon-shaped figure could have been a ritual object or charm for protection. Another possibility is that it was a toy for a child of the elite. Under this theory, some have even likened it to a form that might glide when thrown, given that ancient Egyptians used such hunting tools for birds. Others suggest it functioned as a weather vane, or was mounted on the front of a sacred boat during religious festivals. Any of these uses might fit its context in the Ptolemaic period, but without definitive evidence, they remain educated guesses. The Saqqara bird's fame grew largely due to a controversial idea that it was more than a toy or ritual figurine, that it was actually a model of an ancient Egyptian flying machine. This bold theory took off in the 1960s, when Khalil Massia, an Egyptian physician, suggested the wooden bird was a proof-of-concept glider. He pointed to its wing shape, arguing it could generate lift. The flat top of the tail, he believed, once held a tail stabilizer that later broke off. To test this, Messiah built an enlarged replica with an added tail fin, and according to his reports, the model did glide when launched. This claim was met with some skepticism by the aviation community. Unfortunately, others tried to recreate his supposed experiment, and no one else could replicate the results. Aeronautical engineers who analyzed the artifact have noted practical problems. It's too heavy and unbalanced to glide effectively, especially since it lacks a tail rudder for stability. The academic community also greeted this ancient airplane theory with skepticism as well. No depictions or writings from Egypt hint at any attempt to fly, and a lone wooden model isn't proof of lost technology. All evidence to date suggests the artifact was never meant to be a serious flying device, but rather a static object with symbolic or practical purpose. Some fringe theorists even tied the Sakura bird to ancient astronaut myths of extraterrestrial influence. Under this theory, the bird may not be proof that Egyptians themselves had the technology to fly, but may have been their attempt to explain what they saw. As mentioned, the Sakura bird dates to around 200 BC in Ptolemaic Egypt. By this period, Egypt was fully enmeshed in the Hellenistic Mediterranean world. Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great, had become the intellectual and commercial hub of the region, with the Great Library fostering rapid exchange of ideas and technologies. Had there been genuine evidence of flying machines or extraterrestrial visitors, Greek and Egyptian scholars would surely have recorded it in writings. This was a period where this knowledge would have circulated across Egypt, Greece, and beyond. The complete absence of such accounts in papyri, inscriptions, or classical literature makes the ancient astronaut explanation both unnecessary and unsupported. Despite decades of study, the Sakura bird still remains an Egyptian enigma. That said, all evidence suggests that it was a much more grounded object than some would like to believe. In 1997, a quiet estate in rural Rhode Island became the scene of a chilling discovery. Two new homeowners, investigating a foul odor and an overflowing septic system, opened the underground tank expecting a plumbing issue. Instead, a skull bobbed up in the murky water, and these remains were soon identified as those of Cam Lyman, a multimillionaire dog breeder who had vanished a decade earlier. Cam Lyman was born in 1932 into a prominent Boston family, though his path in life was anything but usual. The Lymans were old money aristocrats who had been established since the 18th century. Cam shared his father's passion for purebred dogs, especially Clumber Spaniels, and became a highly respected breeder and exhibitor in the dog show circuit. By all accounts, Cam was talented yet reclusive, preferring the company of his dozens of prize-winning dogs over people. He never married or had children, and instead, his dozens of show-quality spaniels were his pride and joy. In the 1970s, after his parents passed away, Cam retreated from society almost completely, only communicating with friends from the dog world. After his parents had passed, Cam publicly transitioned to a male identity, though reports suggest his few friends had known this for years. This decision appears to have further alienated him from his aristocratic friends, who already saw him as an unusual and eccentric figure who didn't fit into high society. At around 6 feet tall with a mustache, short cropped hair, and tweed jackets, Cam cut a distinctly masculine figure, and by 1985, he had legally changed his name. Despite a significant inheritance and a multi-million-dollar trust fund, Cam lived in a way contemporary reports called relatively modestly on a 40-acre estate in Hopkinton, Rhode Island. And I assure you that the words relatively are doing some heavy lifting here, since to me it looked like he was living large. He built a high stockade fence around his house and installed no trespassing signs, deterring visitors. Cam's daily life revolved around his kennel of dogs and feeding, grooming, and training them for competition. While he was rich in dog companions, his human friends were few, and mostly also drawn from the same upper-class background. However, one person managed to enter Cam's insulated world: George O'Neill, a fellow dog enthusiast. Cam met George around 1981 at dog shows, and by 1984, he had hired O'Neill as a caretaker and assistant. George helped manage the estate, pay bills, and drive Cam to dog events. In time, George became Cam's closest confidant, and reading between the lines, it looks as though he portrayed himself as a non-judgmental figure in his life. Cam trusted him enough to grant George power of attorney over his affairs, meaning O'Neill could handle Cam's finances and property. According to later court records, Cam even named O'Neill as sole beneficiary in his will, designating that O'Neill would inherit Cam's personal estate upon his death. It was an unusual level of trust, and one that would come under scrutiny once Cam disappeared. Sometime in the summer of 1987, Cam Lyman vanished. The exact date isn't clear, but July 20th, 1987 is often cited as the day anyone last heard from him, as indicated in court documentation which I was able to dig up. George O'Neill would later tell police that he and Cam had an argument over the phone about dog business, and Cam abruptly hung up on him. The next day, O'Neill drove to the Hopkinton estate to check on his supposed friend. What he found was strange. The mansion's doors were left wide open, the telephone had been ripped out of the wall, and Cam was nowhere to be seen. Dozens of Cam's beloved spaniels were unattended on the property. O'Neill claimed he never saw Cam again after that day. Perhaps even stranger, O'Neill didn't report Cam missing, and he later asserted that Cam had a habit of taking off occasionally. This appears to be true, and Cam was indeed an eccentric multimillionaire with no responsibilities beyond his dogs. That said, he took his responsibilities to his dogs extremely seriously, and these animals had been left in a precarious state on the property. O'Neill said he assumed Cam left town voluntarily for a surgery to cement his male identity. However, he offered no evidence for this theory. Nonetheless, O'Neill treated the situation as if Cam was simply away on an extended trip. He continued caring for the dogs and maintaining the estate. He even started showing Cam's prize dogs under his own name at competitions, as if the animals now belonged to him. For over a year, none of Cam's relatives realized he was missing, showing just how secluded Cam's life had become. The first red flag came that winter when Cam failed to send his usual Christmas cards in December 1987. Cam had a tradition of mailing cards each year, and he wasn't known to forget. Still, for reasons which remain unclear, months passed before the family took action. In 1988, Cam's sisters and brother grew increasingly concerned by the silence and by some odd financial signs. Checks from Cam's trust fund, which were normally signed over to him, were being cashed with a strange Rhode Island bank account number instead of Cam's signature. This indicated someone else was depositing Cam's money. By December 1988, nearly 18 months after Cam's disappearance, the Lyman family finally contacted the Hopkinton police and filed a missing person report. They also alerted the law firm managing the Lyman family trust that something was very wrong. When authorities approached George O'Neill in late 1988, he repeated his belief that Cam had likely gone abroad for personal reasons. At the time, local police didn't treat the disappearance as foul play and wrote it off as just an eccentric rich person doing eccentric rich people things. The Lyman siblings hired a private detective named Charles John Allen to dig into Cam's disappearance. Allen quickly grew suspicious of George O'Neill's role, and he discovered that O'Neill had been depositing Cam's investment dividend checks into a Rhode Island bank account. O'Neill, it turned out, had nearly complete control over Cam's money, and he found out about the power of attorney and the will situation. In essence, if Cam had passed, O'Neill stood to inherit a substantial fortune valued at around $2 million. By the early 1990s, the case remained unsolved and increasingly cold. Cam's two sisters, Mary and Edith, pushed to have him officially declared dead in absentia so that his affairs could be settled. In 1994, 7 years after Cam's disappearance, they petitioned the Rhode Island courts for a death declaration. This move drew media attention, partly because of the aspects of the story involving a wealthy individual who sought to transition, which wasn't a commonly known practice at the time. In June 1995, before the skull was found, Cam Lyman was legally declared dead. Despite the legal declaration, Cam's actual fate was still a mystery. No body had been found, and no one had been charged with any crime in relation to the case. George O'Neill continued to maintain his innocence and insisted that he believed Cam was alive somewhere. Everything changed in the fall of 1997, when a twist of fate finally answered the question of where Cam Lyman had gone. That year, Hopkinton got a new police chief, John Skunkio, who decided to take a fresh look at the cold case. Skunkio, a former state police detective, was apparently amazed that a wealthy person's disappearance had never been thoroughly investigated. And yeah, I'm just going to stop here for a second to let that sink in before we move on. He quietly reopened the case and even brought a cadaver-sniffing dog to search Cam's old estate. By this time, Cam's property had been sold to new owners, dog breeder Greg Seiner and a partner, who had purchased the 40-acre spread and moved in with no idea of its dark history. As Skunkio's team was sniffing around the grounds, the new owners themselves stumbled onto the crucial evidence. In late September 1997, Seiner noticed a repugnant smell and sewage backing up, signs of a septic tank problem. On September 24, 1997, Seiner and a friend opened the underground septic area, assuming they'd find a clog. They did indeed find the most horrific clog imaginable, partly caused by a skull floating amid the sludge. Investigators recovered a nearly complete human skeleton from the septic tank, which was located just yards from Cam's old house. Right away, there was little doubt who the remains belonged to. No other person was known to be missing in Hopkinton in that time frame, and Cam had literally been right under everyone's feet the whole time. Over the next year, forensic experts confirmed via dental records that the bones were indeed Cam Lyman. The medical examiner determined that Cam's death was from foul play, likely occurring around the time he disappeared in 1987. In other words, Cam had been slain and his body hidden in his own septic system. Truly a disturbing final resting place for someone who just wanted to be left alone with their dogs. While finding the body brought some closure, it also ignited a further investigation. From the moment Cam was confirmed slain, George O'Neill became the prime suspect in the eyes of many, including Cam's family and the police. The motive seemed clear. As with Cam out of the picture, O'Neill had stood to gain financially and did, in fact, assume control of Cam's assets for years. Several suspicious actions by O'Neill both before and after the disappearance bolster this allegation. George never alerted authorities or family that Cam was missing. He waited until the family contacted police over a year later, and even then he was nonchalant, as if Cam's absence were no big deal. Forensic accountants discovered significant irregularities, and it appeared that a large portion of Cam's net worth ended up vanishing under George's questionable stewardship. O'Neill had legal power of attorney and was named to inherit Cam's estate in the will. This allegedly gave him a strong motive to ensure Cam never returned. Despite all this circumstantial evidence and suspicion, authorities never charged O'Neill, or anyone else, with Cam's slaying. No direct evidence or forensic links to George could ever be established, and interestingly, he wasn't the only credible suspect. There were a couple of other persons of interest floated in Cam's case. One was Bob Regasta, Cam's attorney and co-trustee of the Lyman Trust alongside O'Neill. Regasta had also been given power of attorney by Cam as well, and was named executor of Cam's will. Essentially, Regasta and O'Neill together controlled Cam's finances when he disappeared. If O'Neill had a hand in wrongdoing, some wondered if Regasta could have been complicit, or at least aware. However, no concrete evidence tying Regasta to the disappearance ever surfaced publicly. Another pair mentioned by the authorities were John and Judy Weeks, a couple who worked as caretakers on Cam's property before the sale to the new owners. It's unclear what, if anything, made the Weeks suspicious to investigators, and the case remains an active and ongoing investigation. To date, no charges have been filed against Regasta or the Weeks, and they have denied any involvement. George O'Neill was eventually charged with embezzlement in relation to a false check for $15,000 he had unlawfully cashed for himself. All of the other financial irregularities appear to have simply been chalked up to poor management rather than malice. At any rate, George eventually pleaded guilty to the embezzlement and was given 1-year probation. George O'Neill would die in 2011 without ever revealing any further information about the slaying of Cam Lyman, if he knew anything at all. Anyway, obviously theories about Cam Lyman's passing have centered on the people closest to him, and the most obvious suspect has always been George O'Neill. Still, the theory that O'Neill ended Cam is built almost entirely on inference. There's no forensic evidence linking him to the remains, no eyewitnesses, and no confession. Other figures in Cam's life were mentioned as possible suspects, though nothing concrete tied them to the crime either. The truth is that Cam was reclusive, wealthy, and surprisingly vulnerable and isolated, which meant multiple people may have had reasons to take advantage of him. Given the fact that no functional investigation started until almost a decade later, we may never know who else stood to benefit. Hey everyone, Jimmy reminding you to like and subscribe and to tap the notification bell and turn on all notifications. I've been getting a lot of people complaining to me lately that they haven't seen my latest videos, and clicking the notification bell solves this issue. Also remember, if you want to take your support for my content to the next level, consider joining up with the YouTube channel membership or on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. It was supposed to be a night of birthday celebrations under the stars. In late May 2011, 20-year-old Madison Scott, better known to her friends as Maddie, joined dozens of friends for a camping party at Hogsback Lake. This is a secluded camping site about 10 miles south of Vanderhoof in British Columbia, Canada. By the end of that weekend, Maddie had vanished without a trace, and her pickup truck and tent were found abandoned at the campsite, but she was nowhere to be seen. The baffling disappearance of this vibrant young woman would grip her community for over a decade, until an astonishing break in 2023 finally brought even more questions. On the evening of May 27, 2011, Madison Scott headed out to Hogsback Lake with friends to celebrate a birthday at a popular camping spot. The lake was a peaceful, wooded area with a small campground, and normally a great place for a weekend party around a bonfire. Maddie had even brought a large tent, planning to spend the night by the lake after the festivities. At some point after midnight, most of the group decided to pack up and leave. A friend offered Maddie a ride home, but Maddie chose to stay in camp, intending to sleep in her tent by the lakeshore. By around 3 o'clock on the morning of May 28th, witnesses recalled that Maddie was last seen still at the campsite, now essentially alone, as others departed in vehicles. What happened in the dark, early morning hours after 3 remains a mystery. Another friend swung by the site around 8:30 the next morning to pick up some belongings and noticed Maddie's tent unzipped and her things scattered, but no sign of Maddie herself. At the time, no immediate alarm was raised, as it was possible Maddie had woken up and left the area for a bit. However, when the entire Saturday passed with no word from Maddie, her family grew concerned. By Sunday, May 29th, Madison's parents drove out to Hogsback Lake to check on her. What they found sent a chill down their spines. Maddie's blue tent was collapsed flat on the ground, and her gray pickup truck was still parked there. It was locked and contained her purse and other personal items which she absolutely never would have willingly left behind. Yet Maddie was gone, and after searching the immediate area and calling out for her with no result, her mother phoned the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Now, despite their questionable reputation, it appears they actually conducted a very thorough search here, as you'll see in a moment. Investigators and volunteers launched an intensive search operation almost immediately. The fact that Maddie hadn't contacted anyone all weekend was completely out of character, so police treated the situation as suspicious from the start. Over the following days and weeks, hundreds of people combed through the rough terrain around Hogsback Lake, looking for any trace of the young woman. Search teams scoured the woods on foot and on horseback, while helicopters equipped with infrared cameras flew over the area. Divers plunged into the lake's cold, clear waters, and dogs sniffed through the surrounding brush. Despite the exhaustive efforts, not a single definitive clue turned up in those early searches. There were no footprints leading away from the campsite, no signs of a struggle, and no biological or physical evidence indicating what had happened. In the absence of answers, Maddie's family and the town of Vanderhoof refused to let her case fade. One complicating factor in the investigation occurred just one day after Maddie went missing. On the Saturday night, completely unaware of the soon-to-be unfolding tragedy, something would happen which would potentially destroy a significant amount of evidence. As many as 150 new people showed up to socialize at the lake that night, and they seemed to have held a pretty wild party. Importantly, just so the timeline is clear, this was before Maddie was reported missing, and these weren't people partying in an area of an ongoing investigation. During this gathering, someone reportedly came across Maddie's tent, and not realizing its significance, ended up flattening or tripping over it. By the time police formally processed the scene, any footprints or subtle evidence around the site may have been trampled by this unrelated party. Investigators did identify and question the individual who collapsed the tent, but nothing useful came of it. After nearly 12 agonizing years of mystery, the case saw a major development in late spring 2023. In the last week of May 2023, investigators executed a search warrant on a rural property on the east side of Vanderhoof. Acting on new information, police scoured the property and made a heartbreaking discovery. These were human remains, which the BC Coroner Service soon confirmed to be those of Madison Scott. The location of the discovery raised eyebrows and new suspicions. The rural property where Madison's remains were recovered was just over a mile from Hogsback Lake, not far from where she vanished. According to one report from the CBC, Canada's national broadcaster, it's been alleged that the property belonged to the father of 2 men who saw Maddie at the party that night. Ultimately, while the police believe that foul play was involved, they haven't outright confirmed this, nor have they confirmed the report about the 2 men. The authorities are still investigating the case and have yet to formally name any suspects or persons of interest. You're living in a small New England town in the late 1880s, and word spreads quickly that the Leatherman is due to arrive today, right on schedule. But despite this sinister name, you and the other townsfolk step out to watch as a strange figure trudges into view. He's a bearded man swathed head to toe in a patchwork suit of leather, perhaps 50 pounds of it, scuffed and weather-beaten from endless travel. He moves with a steady determination, indifferent to the rain and mud, a well-worn knapsack on his back and a stout walking stick in hand. It may sound like complete fiction, but this is no myth, but rather the multiple mysteries of a figure beloved by New England locals in the 19th century. The man known only as the Leatherman was a mysterious vagabond who roamed the roads of western Connecticut and eastern New York in the mid-19th century. He first appeared sometime around the late 1850s and spent over 30 years trekking through the region until his death in 1889, and his legend grew over the years. His nickname came from his unusual attire. He had a handmade outfit completely fashioned from leather boots, belts, and scraps. By all accounts, he was a quiet, harmless wanderer who rarely spoke more than a grunt or a polite thank you. Yet despite how odd he was, he became a welcomed sight in many communities, despite his rough appearance, and he was treated with great respect. In fact, he was so respected that towns along his route would eventually pass laws to protect him and stop anyone from interfering with him. Of the Leatherman's personal life, his real name, origins, and motives, little is known for certain. He never explained himself, and the few times people tried to ask, he would abruptly end the conversation or simply wander off. Locals observed that he spoke in broken English but was fluent in French, leading to speculation he was of French or French-Canadian origin. He also steadfastly refused to eat meat on Fridays, strongly hinting at a Roman Catholic background, which I'll be discussing more in a bit, since I have a theory about this. Notably, when he perished, he was found with a French-language prayer book, which unfortunately doesn't appear to have been preserved. While this confirmed that he was indeed a French speaker, the prayer book could have given clues as to whether he was French-Canadian or from France itself. What made the Leatherman truly extraordinary was the regularity of his travels. He walked an enormous circular route of roughly 365 miles, visiting a loop of about 41 towns in Connecticut and New York in sequence. Incredibly, he would complete the entire circuit in about 34 days, almost like clockwork, then start all over again. By the late 1870s, locals had long noticed this pattern, and one newspaper even took to publishing his schedule for anyone who wanted to come see and greet him. He typically traveled on foot and alone, covering an average of around 10 to 11 miles a day to keep on schedule. Wherever he went, the Leatherman had favorite stopping points, and he would stop at particular farmhouses where he would receive food free of charge. However, he wouldn't stay overnight, even when he was offered a warm place to stay, and the reasons for this are unknown. And it's not as though people weren't offering, especially by the 1880s, when he had become a fixture of the communities he was traveling through. Unlike other travelers of the era who sought out barns or shelters, the Leatherman almost always slept outdoors. He typically slept in caves, rock shelters, or hollowed-out spaces along his route. These spots became known locally as Leatherman's Caves, and many can still be found today bearing that name. During brutal winter weather, he would build fires at a cave entrance to warm the interior, and he somehow survived infamous storms of the period. Despite years of sleeping rough through New England winters, by the end of his life he hadn't lost a single finger or toe to frostbite, a testament to his survival skills. This has also been cited as evidence that the Leatherman wasn't someone who didn't have his wits about him. Had he not been extremely proficient in his ability to survive, he wouldn't have made it under these conditions. Although the Leatherman lived apart from society, he was no hermit, In fact, many communities along his route developed an affectionate relationship with the wandering leather-clad man. He never begged outright, but residents knew he relied on their hospitality for sustenance. As his expected day approached, kind families would bake extra bread or pies and set aside coffee for the Leatherman's customary visit. He typically took his meals on the porch or doorstep, rarely coming inside. If invited indoors, he preferred to sit near the door and would often eat quickly and depart, as if eager to stay on schedule. Despite his grizzled, dirty appearance, people were not afraid of him, and he was unfailingly courteous in his own way and seemed content with what little he had. Legally, the late 19th century was not a friendly time for vagrants. Connecticut even passed a strict law in 1879 that allowed police to arrest and jail any homeless wanderers. Remarkably, the Leatherman was held in such regard that at least 10 Connecticut towns passed local ordinances specifically exempting him from the law. He was never arrested, even though officially he was committing a crime by wandering his circuit. He was, however, taken into custody by the authorities in 1888, but this wasn't for the reason you might think. The Leatherman's health was very visibly declining, and the people and the authorities became worried that there was something wrong with him. He was examined at a hospital in Hartford and found to be sane, but highly eccentric, and he refused any further treatment for ongoing medical issues, which I'll discuss shortly. From almost the moment he first appeared, people wondered, who is this strange man, and why is he doing this? The Leatherman himself never gave an answer, so speculation ran wild. In 1884, a Connecticut newspaper attempted to solve the mystery by publishing what it claimed was the Leatherman's real-life story, and the tale was sensational. One popular explanation said the Leatherman was really Jules Bourglet from France. According to this tale, he was a man who fell in love with a leather merchant's daughter, lost his fortune in a failed leather business, and then took to wandering in leather as penance. This romantic tale neatly answered every question people had, and newspapers eagerly reprinted it. But there was a catch. Not a word of it was true. In reality, the Leatherman never divulged such a story to anyone. The reporter had simply invented it when he failed to get an interview, and the newspaper later printed a retraction once the hoax came to light. Despite the debunking of the tale, no further progress was made in finding out who he was, and the Leatherman's real identity remains a mystery to this day. Most researchers believe that he was most likely of French-Canadian background and may have been from either Quebec or New Brunswick in Canada, or from Maine. That said, there does remain the very real possibility that he was actually from France, or that he was born in America to a French, but not French-Canadian family. In the winter of 1889, after more than 30 years on the road, the Leatherman finally succumbed to illness. On March 24, 1889, he was found deceased in one of his caves in the town of Mount Pleasant, New York, not far from Ossining. The cause was determined to be mouth cancer, likely a result of his years of tobacco use. Locals who had looked out for him in life ensured he had a proper burial, and he was laid to rest in Ossining's Sparta Cemetery, although no one knew his real name. For a time his grave was mistakenly marked Jules Bourglet, reflecting the popular legend, but in truth he remained as nameless in death as he had in life. Also, there is something so fittingly poetic about a man who chose to adopt a Spartan lifestyle for his entire known life being buried in Sparta Cemetery. If this was a work of fiction, viewers would say, nah, that's going a bit too far. In 2011, concerns about the old grave's proximity to a roadway led to an exhumation of the Leatherman's remains, and historians hope to finally identify him via DNA. To their surprise, the coffin held only a few nails and scraps of wood, and his body had long since disintegrated and been claimed back by the earth. He was reburied in a new spot in the cemetery, under a fresh headstone that simply reads, "The Leather Man," acknowledging that this mystery will likely never be solved. Personally, I think the Leatherman's mysterious devotion to his wandering life takes on deeper resonance when viewed through the lens of Roman Catholic tradition. He was known to avoid meat on Fridays, a custom deeply rooted in Catholic practice, and he kept with him a French prayer book that suggests a faith carried quietly but consistently. In Catholic history, pilgrimage has long served as an outward expression of inner penance, a way for the devout to atone for sins or seek spiritual renewal. These journeys are marked by hardship and repetition, as well as the renunciation of worldly comforts. For instance, for high nobles to atone in medieval times, they would wear the clothing of beggars and walk barefooted to a holy site and seek forgiveness for whatever they did. Seen this way, his 365-mile loop through Connecticut and New York wasn't just the path of a drifter. It might have been his own private pilgrimage to atone for some unknown act. Each step could have carried the weight of contrition, his leather garb both armor against the elements, and perhaps a symbolic reminder of the burden he chose to bear. His refusal of comfort, his preference for sleeping in caves, and his commitment to an almost monastic silence resonate with traditions of asceticism. Whether or not he consciously framed it in these terms, we have strong evidence he came from this religious tradition, and the Leatherman's life mirrored the age-old image of the penitent pilgrim. In this view, he was a lone traveler walking endlessly, caught between the earthly and the spiritual, seeking not an earthly destination, but some quiet reconciliation between himself and God. In the end, why the Leatherman felt the need to wander and who he was remain a genuine, unsolved historical mystery. On a cool October evening in 1983, 19-year-old Patty Osborne stepped out of a Seattle motel and into the neon glow of Aurora Avenue. She told her quote-unquote boyfriend she was heading to meet a man at a nearby restaurant, a quote-unquote date arranged by phone. She never made it to that meeting, and Patty vanished without a trace into the night. In a city already on edge from a string of grisly attacks targeting young women, Patty's disappearance would soon become part of one of the most notorious cases in American history. Patty Osborne's life hadn't been easy to say the least, and she grew up in a very rough household. Born in 1964, she grew up in Washington State, and by her teenage years struggled with substance use and frequent trouble with the law. At just 17, Patty left her family home for good and drifted into life on the streets of Seattle, where she became involved in illicit work to survive. Despite the hardships and risky lifestyle, Patty remained in contact with her mother, Patricia Muse. She never let a holiday or birthday pass without a phone call home, a reassurance that she was still alive and thinking of her family. Concerned and unable to reach her daughter, Patty's family feared the worst as the fall of 1983 dragged on. On October 28, 1983, Patty was last seen along Seattle's North Aurora Avenue, an area dotted with motels and known strolls for this sort of paid work. She had been staying with a man described as her boyfriend at a motel on North 115th Street in Aurora. That evening, Patty left the motel room to meet a client at a nearby restaurant. The plan was routine for Patty's line of work, but something went terribly wrong. When her boyfriend realized she hadn't come back, and with no word from Patty in the days that followed, it became clear she had mysteriously disappeared. Patty's disappearance didn't happen in isolation, and Seattle was in the grip of fear during late 1983, as dozens of young women were going missing or turning up deceased. Just the previous year, in 1982, police had discovered the bodies of 5 women in or near the Green River in King County, sparking a massive investigation. Throughout 1983, more women connected to the case went missing, and several bodies were found dumped in wooded areas around Seattle's suburbs. Many of the victims, like Patty, were living on the outskirts of life and were in this illicit line of work or were young runaways. It was against this backdrop that Patty Osborne vanished, and investigators quickly suspected her case was not a simple missing person, but something far more sinister. Within months of Patty's disappearance, law enforcement added her name to the growing list of women believed to have been slain by the then still unidentified Gary Ridgway. This is a name, of course, that's well known to anyone with even a passing familiarity with crime. The Green River investigation stretched on for years without an arrest. It would go on to become one of the largest and longest-running serial predator cases in American history. Finally, in November 2001, a major breakthrough came when DNA technology linked a longtime suspect, Gary Ridgway, to several of the attacks. Ridgway was arrested and eventually struck a plea bargain to avoid the DP, and he agreed to confess to everything so the authorities could bring closure to the families of the victims. In 2003, Gary Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts, making him one of the most prolific confirmed serial predators in history. As part of his cooperation with authorities, Ridgway provided information on many of his victims, including details that helped recover remains of women long missing. In the course of these interviews, Ridgway also admitted to slaying Patty Osborne. However, unlike most of his other confessions, his admission, lacking detail and physical evidence, wasn't enough for prosecutors to bring a formal charge in Patty's case. With no body and no forensic proof, authorities had to leave Patty Osborne's case officially unsolved, even as Ridgway went to prison for life for the numerous other cases. In the final plea agreement, King County Sheriff officials removed Patty's name from the list of victims Ridgway was charged with, citing the lack of evidence. This, of course, was an awful feeling for Patty's family, who thought that there would be some form of justice for Patty now that Ridgway was clapped in cuffs. At present, most believe that Gary Ridgway was indeed responsible for the slaying of Patty Osborne in 1983. However, there are lingering doubts, because aside from her and 2 other women, he was able to provide great detail on all his crimes and reveal the locations of his victims' bodies. Unfortunately, Patty's body has never been recovered, and the authorities have hoped that Gary Ridgway, who is still alive, may one day sing like a canary. Personally, I believe that he may have simply forgotten the location of her body, since he didn't deny committing this horrible act against her. Notably, he did explicitly deny being connected to a few other victims, who the task force had thought he had slain, so I suspect he wouldn't lie about Patty's case. And actually, as I read that out, that kind of sounds ridiculous. This guy is one of the most prolific predators of all time, so obviously his word isn't worth a thing. Jimmy here once again, just quickly signing off and wishing you positive vibes and a chill time. And with that said, peace out everyone, and don't forget to check out my other videos.